So right now we just had lunch, I guess, so we kind of all feel a bit like that. It may not be very pleasant, but we are all like that, so no problem. So who I am? My name is Cyril Martraire. I'm from Paris. You can hear that at my French accent, so sorry for that. I've been doing code till 99, and you can follow me on Twitter at Cyriux. So I also founded the Paris Software Car Friendship community like almost 2 years ago. We meet every month, and for instance, so we do open space sessions and also hands-on sessions like this TDD special session. And the last session was on the attitude with the middle management, so something totally different. I also founded and also the CTO of a company called Arola, and we are specializing in software development, TDD, BDD, and so forth. So that's things we are passionate about. So first, a little warning. This session is a talk, so there is no spectacular things. I won't show you extraordinary stuff, no live coding, just trivial Java code. And of course, I encourage everyone to retry to do that at home or in the office the next day. So the point of this talk is all about sharing, talking about style. It's all about style. And Alberto Brandolini, I don't know who knows Alberto Brandolini. So he's a DDD trainer, and so Zero Brando on Twitter. Alberto Brandolini likes to draw this little chef to talk about the code gourmet, and so it's all about matter of taste, about having better taste when you write code. So it may look simplistic, but actually that's the way the things I will talk about are the way to deal with increasing complexity. While keeping the control of the software we are building. So my first encounter with functional programming concepts was from domain-driven design. And surprising declaration, surprising statements. And so it's a bit personal, but that's my story. And I want to share with you things I feel very close to, things that are close to my heart. So the question I've asked is, domain-driven design and FP, what do they have in common? What's the point of this talk? So first, domain-driven design. Who knows a bit about domain-driven design here? A little bit. I'm sure Rebecca knows a bit about it. All right. Who doesn't know anything about domain-driven design? Yeah. Okay. So domain-driven design comes from a book by Eric Evans. So published already 10 years ago. We're going to celebrate the 10 years soon. So Eric Evans here in the training. So Eric, and this book draws on legacy. No, it's not a legacy, it's better than that. It was inspired. Eric Evans recently on Twitter said that if Martin Fauser was the grandfather of the domain-driven design, Rebecca, and we are happy to be with Rebecca today, would be the grandmother of the domain-driven design. So all these things are related, and the patterns and so forth are related with that. The core thing of domain-driven design is to focus on the domain. We tend to focus too much on the technical stuff, and this focus on the domain is the key thing of domain-driven design, and the rest are a set of techniques to achieve that. So the book focusing in the domain-driven design proposes a lot of technique, practices, and patterns to help align the code with the domain, and so that we can read the domains by reading the code. So it's all about style, it's all about enabling the style. And what I noticed as well was that domain-driven design is especially attracting for senior developers. So it's not uncommon to meet people with 20, 25 years of experience in DDD meetups or everything about DDD. Anyone with more than 20 years experience here? Okay. DDD is hard to explain. It's very hard to explain briefly, because actually it's as if you had 4 books into one. So just a disclaimer: in no way we can cover domain-driven design shortly. This is a style I've adopted in 2005, and I've been very lucky with it. That's kind of a secret weapon in my arsenal, and I'm still in love with it. So that's for domain-driven design, the very simplest thing I could say. And now, what do you think about when we talk about FP, functional programming style? Who knows a lot about FP here? Some exposure? Sorry? Some exposure, anyone, on FP style? Yeah. So many people, for many people, FP is what's this thing? That's just crazy stuff from academician in somewhere strange. So it's all about lambda as well. So in C# you have them already. In Java we expect to have them one day, hopefully. We don't know.
Q1.
Yeah, next year.
Q1 2014.
All right. FP also we have some kind of images like that. Lisp and the father of Lisp. Strange haircut and the like. And of course, all these languages, which are pure functional programming languages. My point is not to talk about that at all, is how can we draw some inspiration, from this style in our everyday commercial programming in Java or C#, maybe JavaScript. So it's a matter of style and borrowing the style in our everyday work. So of course, functional programming takes its name from the focus on functions, and it's not any kind of function, it's about functions that are pure, so they are very clean, like that. So it's all about putting the side effect outside of the picture. Of course, you need some side effect, but for the program to be useful, but we want to keep it minimum and at the edge. And also, we don't like state in functional programming. So no state, no problem. That's basically the idea. And so again, it's a matter of style. With self-discipline, we can avoid a lot of state. And functional programming also has a lot of things and this kind of obscure jokes like that. Who understands this joke? Is it funny? I think it is, but I'm not even sure. Trapped in IU monad, please help. Well, that's a test. So all these things about monad and so forth. Alright, so that was all about the theory about functional programming. So if you are a functional programming purist, you may be disappointed. So what do domain-driven design and functional programming have in common? That's a good question. And so if we take a look at the table of content, from the book from domain-driven design, we can see a few interesting things, and we're gonna go through them quickly. So it starts with value objects, and then we can see side effect free functions. Looks like something. Maybe FP style, closure of operations, declarative style, and drawing on established formalisms. So it may not clear right now for you, but that's what I will share. And maybe if we learn one, you get a bit of the other for free. That's also something interesting to notice. It's worth investing in. So if we take a look at about styles between domain-driven design, which is usually applied in object-oriented mindset, and if we take the intersection with this FP style, we end up with something interesting and with a very nice style of code. I'm tempted to say beautiful code. It's all about appreciation, but. And so let's try that with a little practice. So we need practice. I just went to Prague. Dave Thomas CodeKata's website, and I chose a random kata about temperatures. So it's funny because this morning we already talked about weather, statistics, so the same example again. So we have temperatures evolving over time, and we want to do something with it. So I took the file from Dave Thomas, and so this file is just plain data, and if we take a focus, it's unlucky that it's a bit short, cut at the top. I'm going to explain. Here we are supposed to have the days, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 till 30. So the name of the day, the number of the day. We have the max temperature column, the minimum temperature columns, and the units. So Fahrenheit or Celsius. And the exercise is to compute the daily spreads, so the delta between the min and the max, line by line, to compute the mean, like daily average between the min and the max, and then to compute the monthly average, so vertically, what was the average temperature or mean temperature and max temperature for the month. So nothing that difficult. So okay, let's take it, go, write code, boom, okay, it's done. So no TTD here, consider it's done, it works. And so here we read the file. Then we compute the spread, very easy, just a difference, boom, boom, and we print that to the console all in one. We run it, we can see our deltas. Okay, we're done. I'm a craftsman. Okay, next step. We are happy with that. Next step. Compute the mids. Oh, so I copy paste the first one, of course, and I just change what I need to change to do the mid. So just the sum and divide it by 2, and I'm done. And by the way, I divide with an integer, and right now it looks enough. That's a rounding thing, but who cares? And so, yeah, that's the thing. So we run it, and we got the values, and it's okay. It works. We are done again. We won't be able to scale a lot like that. That's something to do, and looks like there is some duplication. Agree? If we look at this code side by side, they look pretty similar. And you can't read, but they are all examples of what we call, or Martin Fowler called, transaction scripts. So something very linear from end to end, doing the 100% of the job in one go. So like a batch. So this is how people used to do software in the past, and I even know some people that still do that today. So if we want to improve that, we notice that they are very similar, and then we try to look, can we find a structure in that? And there is one structure. There is data access, something about temperatures, so we can say it's maybe domain related, and some presentation. We send something to the console. Everything is either identical or very similar, so we are tempted to factor out this part. So we exploit the methods in the middle, and even these methods are very close, so we can consider these two methods, these two functions are part of the domain of the same domain thing. And this is how we can see that just by refactoring, we already can see the emergence of the domain layer and the other layers. So layers, it's not just a good practice, random good practice. It's just something that naturally emerges from repeated application of refactoring, and every time we see duplication. So this layer is, of course, a prerequisite for any kind of domain-driven design, because we have to focus on the domain. We will ignore the rest, and we'll focus on this middle layer where the domain lives. And so we love that, first thing, and we want to make it clean. So everything about domain will be in this layer in the middle, and everything technical will not be in this layer, it will be outside, and we want to be very strict on that. Very strict means that I don't want any dependency on anything legacy, middleware, frameworks, database stuff, even Logger. I'm very strict personally. I don't want even any logging to pollute the domain layer. This is the domain layer where I will put a lot of care in the practices, clean code, and so forth. And we can also decide that null is not welcome within the domain layer, and we can have a domain layer 99% null free. All right, so we have a domain layer. Now, let's look again at these different stages. So we have the loading the data, outputting the data, and we have the processing in the middle. And so if we can see that the outputting the data is totally a side effect. Loading the data is not really a side effect, but very close. If we run it several times, we may not have the same result. It's not referentially transparent, as they say in functional programming world. But in the middle, we have something very interesting. We have a very interesting property. It is side effect free. If I put the same temperature to the calculation, I'll end up with exactly the same result. This is something very precious, and we want to maximize these kind of situations. So, and that's what Eric Evans is saying in his book. We should favor functions and methods with no side effect whenever we can. So it's a matter of taste. It's also to make our life simpler. So here we introduce some data structures, arbitrary. I would not even say objects. They can be objects, but they are not really objects. They are just exchange DTOs, if you like. And we have these functions that take these records, do the processing, and return another data structures. The nice thing with this side effect free function is that they are very easy to test. That's the dream case for testing. So some people like to mock everything, but every time you got these side effect free functions, you don't need to mock anything. They are so simple to test that you don't need to mock anything. That's why we may disagree sometimes, but actually we don't disagree. We just manage to create a world where we don't have the need for mocking. So it's a different, for TDDs, there are two schools like that. So I'm more on this school, on the school. And so in this approach, we can consider that every, when you test something, it's just like testing that the left expression is equal to the expression on the right. It's just like balanced vision of what we are doing. And for recurrence, it's very important that your test reflects that. So if you can put that in one line, expected equal the call to the method or function, and everything on one line, that's the ideal case. You see, they have the same, they are equivalent. You could replace one with another. So that's the ideal case, and we want to go to the ideal case whenever we can. So it's a matter of taste and self-discipline, not just for the beauty of it, but because it will make our life easier later on. So in a recent project, for instance, the last result, it was a complex project generating cash flows for every possible financial instrument, even complex derivatives and so forth. But technically, it was just a little lib, side effect free, and you just pass values in and you get values out, as simple as that. So this is very nice because you can do simulation, you can do things in the past, you can simulate whatever. You are not attached to anything like the current date, the current time, the current state of the database, and so forth. So that's the ideal world, and we want to live there. All right. So coming back to our kata, we want to compute the average of all this data vertically. So we just have to do the sum and divide by n, the number of elements. The thing is that they are not all with the same units. So we have something like that. How do we do that? Well, it's not a problem for a developer these days. We just do an if and convert. All right. So we do it. Okay, you got the picture. So we need to do something. Whenever there's duplication, I notice that at work, many people, they have the reflex is extract method, and that's all. Duplication, extract method. Okay, but extract the function, I'm not very, for me, can we try to do better than that? And I think we can do better. Why not extract a type? Instead of working with primitives and functions, and extracting functions at the side, why not promote the primitive into its own type? And for instance, why not call it temperature? With a value, the temperature, and the unit, Celsius or Fahrenheit. This way, we can put behavior with it. So nothing special to say is plain old object-oriented code. It may be plain old, but I don't see that much. I don't see that often at work. So that's why I thought it was interesting to talk about it again and again and again, and to insist on that. So in practice, in practice, you have this temperature class with private final immutable fields. So the unit is an enum, and I make sure the enum is immutable. So immutable means you cannot change it in whatever way. You have no way to change it. So the constructor does everything, setting up the data, and then you have no way to change the data inside. We have primitive here, so no problem. It will be, with the final, it's already immutable. But if we had collections, we would have to defense to make it immutable, and so forth. The constructor, the hash code equals, the toString that prints something very convenient for us as humans. Most of the time it will be to debug, so I want to see something as human as possible, and we can, very often we can make it. Notice that we have no getters and setters. Setters, we never want to put them. Getters, it depends. If we don't need them, why put them? We'll see. It will be driven by the needs. So these immutable good things first brings a lot of goodness. First, there's a full class of bugs you get rid of, and you can also keep the old state. So the full can with this kind of bugs is like, for instance, if you will change data with a third party, they can mutate your data and make you crash without you knowing. So all these things, all these problems disappear as soon as you make your code immutable. You can keep the old state, you can safely share everywhere, etc. So I guess you already know who does immutable code already often. I was expecting it was a bit more fashionable already. Okay. So this temperature class is not any kind of class. It is actually what we call a value object. And so value objects are usually, and they should be, immutable. And value objects, their equality is clearly defined by the values they have in their field. So if we look at the equals, it's just about comparing the inside data for equality. Or here we decided that close equality was enough. If the values are very close, we say they are the same. This is something we need to discuss with domain experts, of course, if it makes sense. But with money, for instance, we have to do that because the rounding is clearly defined in money. That's it, and the hash code, of course. And so it's not even any kind of value object, it's actually a quantity. So the quantity pattern. It's fun because Rebecca talked about it this morning. So double coincidence today. So the quantity pattern is all about putting the unit with the number. So something extremely common that we should do all the time, yet I don't see that often in practice. So if we compare that to FP, what's the point with FP? In FP, in most FP languages, everything is a value. In a lot of languages, you don't have a choice. And so actually this style, value object, is a matter of style. You're on your own to do it. And this, I would say, this is a DDD pattern to import this FP-ish kind of doing the stuff into your regular object-oriented language. So it's kind of backport, something. And this style, I was happy when I saw that Aaron Erickson was saying that this functional first style. So whenever you can, the default, the first thing to try is to make everything value object. And if you really can't, then try something else, like entities, services. And that's the way, and without state, immutable and without state. So that's the style I'm following since 2005 basically, and it pays off a lot. I'm in love with this style in plain Java. Even in Java 4 you could do that. And so we have value objects that can be even more precise. There can be quantities, range is a very usual suspect. You have ranges everywhere. Money, currency, the amount is a very common example as well. Alright, so when I say we can do that often in calculation intensive areas, my gut feeling is that I'm able to use value objects for 90% of everything I write. In Java, for instance, if the number of values is limited, you can use enum. It's a perfect class, very lightweight class to do value objects. The Java enum from Java 5 is perfect for that. You don't have that in C#. Sorry guys. No, the enum in C# is much inferior. It's not polymorphic. You are missing a lot of goodness. And so, why all that? These value objects, this import from FP style and FP restriction, if you look at it closely, it's all about forbidding yourself of doing stuff. You forbid yourself from changing data. You forbid yourself from using a var primitive. You force yourself to go to this pattern which requires some little extra work. But this is the key for the battle against complexity. Whenever you have your domain growing and you have to meet challenging use cases all the time, this is the way you can fight the battle, because at every step you can encapsulate the details, like the unit here, processing the units, being unit safe. You encapsulate inside the value objects, and from the outside it becomes simple again. And if we do that repeatedly, there's no limit. The sky is the limit. So in finance, in interesting R&D projects, that's things that just save my life. Okay, so coming back to this value object, we have a temperature class, and we have two methods. We remember we are supposed to do conversion from Fahrenheit to Celsius and the other way around. The funny thing is that they return the same type as the class itself. Okay? So now we're gonna go further and do our actual average. So we want to do that. So first code that we are tempted to write is something like this. We do the processing, we take our temperature, we convert to Celsius, and then we call getValue. We add the getter to get the primitive, and we sum the primitive and return the result. I'm not very happy with these two Celsius get values, because we are actually looking inside the object to do the work. And so it is a Demeter violation, a law of Demeter violation. what I would expect would be something more like the way I think about it. I just take the temperature, I add it to another, and then I divide by 2. So I would like to do that. And in TDD, exactly, when we write the test, we actually dream about our ideal way we would like to read the code. And that's what I would write in TDD. And then I just ask the Eclipse or IntelliJ to generate the methods, so the add and scale. And so every time we have to create a new value, to change the value, we actually don't change it, we create a new one. So this means we new temperature all the time. So we do the calculation and we wrap again with the type. All right, and so now it's interesting, we have now the 4 methods doing the job. And they all manipulate nothing but temperature in, temperature out. Or nothing. It's all about temperature and temperature and temperature everywhere. This is what Eric Evans called the closure of operations. This closure means that if you have a set of elements, which are that are the elements of the type, every possible temperature, we have functions, the methods of the type, that are closed within this set. Every operation returns something which is already in the same set. This property is genius. I don't know. I hope to make you feel about that, but it's just genius. And this closure of operation is just a simple thing to look at, just to look after these cases. And whenever you meet them, you can simplify your life big time, because you can chain everything. You get infinite composability with that. So Steve Freeman and Enterprise talked about that recently at Devoxx, and composability is something we really are looking for. We are really looking for. So I just love that, and I'd like to share this love with all of you today. So this means that in my mind, when I think about that, I just add temperatures, and I get another temperature. In the code, it will just be the same thing. Max, add min. So in some way we are promoting our objects into full arithmetics, custom arithmetics for our domain. That's the way I was thinking about it at the beginning. So I was calling that arithmetics of objects. So coming back to the average, now it can be written more concisely and especially unit safely. So we start with we do basically the same thing, but instead of having primitives, we do just the same thing with the object equivalent. So in C# with the operator overload, you could even keep the plus sign, which you can do in Java. So no excuse for that. So we are really done here, except that we still have some duplication in our two functions. Remember the functions from the beginning in the domain layer? They basically have the same structure. We create a new list, and for each element of the 2 initial lists, we add them or subtract them and create a third list. So in functional programming languages, you have a lot of predefined functions, higher order functions, to do this kind of stuff. In this case, to deal with this duplication, we could do a zipper. I think it's called like that. We take 2 collections of the same size and apply some function element by element and create a third one. Okay, it could solve the problem, and that's why I'm not always totally happy with functional programming factoring. This factoring has nothing to do with the domain. And I think we can do even better. What if we made the code even closer to the domain? How do domain experts think about it? How do they, what they say when they talk about these temperatures together? How would they sketch the thing? So the language is not just bad words, it's also about sketching, the mindset, every possible way we can explain something to someone. So go out and see them. So our domain experts, actually you recognize them, the Unix guys. So please tell us about your domain. So blah 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 blah, time series, blah 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 blah. What? Time series? Okay, yeah, let me show you. So sketching. So you see we got this time series about maximum temperatures, daily maximum temperatures, and the means we just divide and we get spreads. Okay, that's simple. Okay. So why not introduce this time series into our code? This way we can write literally what you're saying. And again, you see, we are coming again to the same. We are using the same practice, the same technique, to make the code equivalent to the way people think about the domain. So again, it's a value object, but here we have an array or a collection of points inside. So we are kind of wrapping a naked collection into a full real type. So to me, it's also a functional style, because in functional programming, it's very common that every function manipulates single elements and lists all together. We want to be able to, we are used to processing things collectively, and that's something we can do as well like this, but we can do even better. We can put a domain facade on top of it and have them carry the words of the domain. So it's like custom on-the-fly functional style in your code. So value objects again, and again closure of operations, because time series together combine to create time series that you can combine to create even more time series. So, and the other good thing is that they are composable, and this means you can do any complex calculations, and the for loop is coded once forever. You never have to do any for loop anyhow. Sorry, anytime. My French. So, for instance, in finance, we are working a lot with yield curves, market data curves, and so forth. And this is just too good to use. You create your curves once and you combine them together, and it becomes as simple as A plus B, but actually you're dealing with large sets of data or even functionals hidden inside or whatever you want, mocks, whatever, you can combine everything together. So it simplifies with this kind of approach. No problem, you can kill 10,000 lines of code into 100, very simply. One day I want to definitely ask to do this exercise one day, to take that and to try to do the other way around, to expand into procedural code, to find out how much code it can, inflate if we convert this style into the equivalent, because in equivalent we have to do every combination of everything with for loops ad hoc. It will be terrible. So anyway, so this ends up from this example and the other, we go closer towards something that is usually called declarative style. So there is no clear definition of what is a declarative style, of course, declarative style. But Eric Evans found that important enough to dedicate a section in his book about that. Declarative style means that we are not focused on solution, showing the code step by step. Instead, we want to show the things in the way we think about it, the way describing the problem domain instead of describing a solution. Okay, so far we have emerged the domain layer. We have seen how better style can emerge from restless refactoring, but with a twist. It's not just random refactoring, it's refactoring with the deliberate willingness to go closer to the domain. And we wrote code with no naked primitives and no naked collections. So for those, if you know object calisthenics, they go very well together. Object calisthenics can already push toward the direction. It also helps improve what I call the signal-to-noise ratio. So if you see, there's supposed to be a face here, which is a signal, and there is a lot of snow, that is a noise. And the noise makes it hard to find out the signal in the noise. So these value objects and every method, every associated method, declarative style helps write code with a much better signal-to-noise ratio. It's easier to read the domain inside out of the technical noise.
How do you measure that?
So again, it's a gut feeling. I didn't measure rigorously. How I did measure that? I just counting everything that we name, method names, class names, interface names, and out of them, what are the ones that I will be ready to show to business people? And the one I would show to the business people out of the total numbers would give me an equivalent of signal-to-noise ratio. So I like to 8 out of 10. To me, it's totally doable in the domain model. Again, in the domain layer. You could write a metric for that. Huh? I'm sure it could be automated. That's by the way, we are close to that with a notation to mark what is domain specific and what's not. So next thing, I will go quickly with it, is we want traceability of the processing. So typically people use a logger for that. log4j, log4net. But here I don't want to introduce a logger in my, because logger means side effect. It's evil. No, I'm kidding, but it's side effect. So, but we have types. We have our time series and we have our temperature types. So no worry, it can be very simple. We just need to add an extra field inside our value objects that will collect the history of what happened and within the object itself. So everybody using the object will never know. The change to the code base will be minimum, just within the type itself. So I'll show you. Whenever we do an addition, we also log. So we take the existing history and we just append what happened in this case. And same thing here. So we just it's like a string builder, and we append everything together after the previous history. So when we run the code, then here I can see that the value I got is actually came from 0 plus 65 Fahrenheit plus 14 Celsius, and all that at this point was divided by half. So of course we are missing parentheses, and so forth. We could make it better and or using another pipe to separate the steps. But it tells you the full history. This means that outside of your domain model, you get that, and you can, if you really want to log, you get that, and you log it. But you're free also to put it into a database. And in finance, usually this kind of information are critical to the business, and they want to store it in a structured way. So this also helps to that. So this is again, I also see that as functional style, because people doing monad are more than that, but monads, they also use a bit this idea to encapsulate the side effect, the desired side effect that you want to do one day inside objects, and the people using the objects don't even know, it doesn't pollute anyone. It stays inside. And so each value stores the history this way. And so that's how you can avoid logging framework in domain layers. And so what we've seen draws on established formalism and other patterns from recurrence, because actually what I call object arithmetics actually is totally one-to-one. It has names, it belongs to mathematics, and mathematics already have names for that, like magma, monoids, and vector spaces. So on Wikipedia you can find all the definitions. Closure of operations actually is called closure as well. And you have additional properties, like there exists an identity element exists, and so if you add the temperature 0, it will always give you 0. It will not change the value, and so forth, like 0 in integers. And what's funny is that again, in functional style, sometimes they use options, but here options looks like a null to me. Null objects under the same interface than temperature, for instance, could do the identity element in our temperature family. So, for instance, if we have calculations of tax, I would prefer to have a special calculation of tax that does nothing and that is still a calculation of tax, rather than having null or something different. Because for everybody using this calculation, you don't care. You just use it as usual, and you don't care that it just does nothing. Okay, so for the maths part, we are close to the end. Wikipedia is your friend, and so maybe everything I said is just nonsense, but that's your goal. That's your call. So in closing, this I think it's very worthwhile to invest time learning domain-driven design, because at the same time, if you care about this style, element of style, you also get a free functional style exposure. Also, the funny thing is that this FP influence really helped me get a better grasp of functional, helped me write better object-oriented code. And so that's why I don't really buy when people oppose object-oriented NFP, and OO is supposed to have every drawbacks of the world, like default means OO means mutability, means a lot of state, a lot of statefulness and side effects and so forth, and it doesn't have to be. It's your choice to do OO the right way or the wrong way, in my opinion. So that's a paradox. So DTD and FP, to me, it's really a love story. Functional programming is beautiful, that's for sure. But together with OO and domain-driven design, we can end up with something I would call taste-driven development, to write beautiful code that makes sense for everyone, from the domain to developers, and not something like that. So I'm done with this, we are done. So now if you have any question on this stuff, I'm happy to answer, or you may as well just say goodbye, but it's your thing. Any question? No question.
You said you didn't want to use zip when creating the timescale or something. So how do you write that code? Do you do something similar to zip? I didn't understand.
I use the for loop or a while or something like that. It's just doing the zipper yourself. Exactly.
But it's a for loop for add. It's another for loop for subtract.
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah. I will not use this factoring. Exactly. That's the twist. If you favor factoring at all costs, you end up with zipper. That's what, outside of any domain, you could not do better for the creator of functional languages. My feeling is that they try to get every possible factoring that doesn't depend on the language that they could. But in our case, my preference would be to put the domain first, and so I'm happy to keep this little duplication inside, only twice. There's a for loop within the add and another within the subtract. To be honest, we can do a little better than that. If we also have something like negate, something that returns the same thing but the opposite sign, you could compose them to do the subtract. Subtract would be add of negate. And you see, there's a reuse, but on another axis. And this axis makes sense to the domain. That's the difference. So it's all about a personal choice. My choice is domain first, whatever, no matter what. And don't worry about maintaining two loops in the same class with a unit test all around. Who knew about the zipper, by the way? Who knows the zipper? 3, 4, okay. That's.
You mentioned two methods, such as a value object and non-null object, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any others that you just mentioned?
Yes, absolutely.
Someone I was expecting you to use some lambda expressions or to pass some, exactly pass some functions into the script.
You could implement like that inside. If you have a functional API, functional SDK like I don't know lambda.j or Guava or something like that, you can
Just
use
C#.
or just C#.
Yeah.
But what I see is it's funny because the more power you have like that with the syntax, the less domain you do. Actually, that's what I see in workshops. For instance, with LINQ in C#, if we did this kata together with seasoned C#ers, they immediately solve the problem in one go with LINQ, and then you don't see the opportunity for refactoring later on to let the domain abstraction emerge. So the more powerful tools you get, the less critical you become with respect to the domain and to does this code really tells the domain story. That's why I don't expect the closure and lambdas in Java. I don't need them that much because most of the time they belong to my implementation, not to my visible interfaces.
Well, I expect that once you'll get them,
of course, I will use them because this will enable to get rid of the for loops and to implement in one line. The implementation will be almost nothing. It will be also declarative inside.
Yeah. Speaking of domain, yeah. So then I'm thinking of the temperature class. I've seen some method there, like such as a get hash code and so. Those are not methods. They are not domain methods.
No, they are not.
And I'm not sure if they were public or not. Probably not.
They are.
They should be just infrastructure, from my point of view, right?
You're right.
I mean,
Except
they are just polluting the domain, right?
absolutely. I agree. That's because Java had this idea of using again follow at the pattern for that. It's the super object style of things. Every object extends objects. But that's true that in an ideal world we could have factored that out or made it separate. But on the other hand, we want to have control of our equality. No, it's not really true. In Scala, the case class does the same thing, and you don't have to declare your own equality. In the Java enum as well, I love Java enum because it's a shorthand for a value object. It's limited to sets of a limited number of data. It's an enum, so it's fixed in size. But if you have a domain with only 10 possible values, I jump to an enum in Java because it gives me the equals, the hash code for free. You don't write it, so it doesn't pollute the code. I agree with that. In C#, I think you got the choice. You can put the equality outside. But in C#, I would keep it inside because it's part of the definition of my value object. The equality, the way to be equal, the identity based on the values, is intrinsic to the type. So no matter what, we have to keep it inside the type. So I agree, it's a pollution. It's a little pollution, but that's the way Java is, and we may want to fight a bit the environment, but not too much. So there are battles to do and not.
Thinking again of domain objects and transactions, what would you recommend as a path of list those in transactions?
Transactions?
Well,
technical transactions, I mean? Like database?
Not necessarily database transactions, but you will use those objects with states and so on in transactions.
Well, I don't see. Actually, I'm not sure I get the question because transactions we never. Usually, I manage to keep everything about transactional stuff, infrastructure stuff outside of the domain model. So the relationship is all about mapping between the value objects. At some point, we map them. For instance, these value objects can be embedded in Hibernate or Hibernate as embedded or embeddable stuff. And if I can, I will even copy the data to something else so that my value objects will not be polluted by the Hibernate annotations or attributes or whatever.
Some people are recommending patterns such as unit of work. Could you recommend something?
Yeah, but it has nothing to do with that. If you use Hibernate, the unit of work is built in. And again, it will be in the infrastructure part. So, and if you need another equality outside for the transaction, and it may well happen, then you need to copy into another object with another equality, or to define another equality comparable in C#. And that's a very good thing. In a former presentation on the same project, I had this surprising remark that the same concept inside this context was a value object, and outside it was an entity with a primary key in database. So this means there's a mapping between one to the other, a kind of matching operation. And so it's a value object inside, it's an entity outside. It depends on how you look at it. So it simplifies the calculation to deal only with value objects. But whenever you want to remember about the past and store the evolution of this cash flow, for instance, it was cash flow, you want to put an arbitrary ID that tracks the evolution of this cash flow over time. It becomes an entity, and you get the unit of work. That maybe that's your answer. So the cost is a kind of duplication somewhere, but it's not duplication. It's just different point of view, and in domain-driven design, different points of view, different context. This is not duplication. This is a good thing actually. That dry is not always the solution. Some duplication is useful.
I generally find that when I want to do things like logging on top of things, I end up making my temperature class will become an interface, and then I would have two implementations: one which contains the values, and one which tracks it and does the logging.
Yes, I agree that I have some reservation with this thing when the traceability, because the traceability kind of pollutes the confusing, makes the equality a bit confusing. I will not create an interface and subclasses and so forth, because then the equality is even worse to define. But this is true that it's already maybe a compromise to keep the history, because if you have two values with the same unit and the same amount, but they have different histories, are they equal or not? I don't know. This is a valid matter. But actually, it's also something to be discussed, not just developers. We can also discuss it with people outside. Would they consider it the same? I'm not sure. I guess no, in fact. So in fact, it becomes back a full value object. We are done?
Yeah.